Okay, so this is the study guide review for exam one. Okay, so for the chapter two stuff, I just want you to know the difference between quantitative research and qualitative research, right? We talked about this in class. Quantitative research is typically large-scale research with statistics where you interpret things mathematically, while qualitative research is when you're looking at small-scale questions, and you're typically doing this by asking respondents how they understand their own world, right? Like interviews or things like that. All right, and then the rest of these are referring specifically to the part of your textbook where the answer can be found. So as far as ethnography, the advantages, what I'm looking for there is that it studies marginalized groups and it often reshapes people's stereotypes because these groups don't, a lot of people don't have information about them and they can gain that through ethnographic research. Interview methods, the different kinds of questions there. Just the idea, like, just to have a basic understanding that open-ended questions leave you the option to answer in any way you see fit. Closed-ended questions are typically giving you a specific criteria. Do you believe this or that? Or they're saying yes or no. And this idea of leading questions where you're kind of trying to pull someone to a specific answer. So saying things like, you always do this, right? Instead of saying like, how do you feel about this? And then there's double-barreled questions as well, which are the kind where they're trying to ask more than one thing with one question. So often they'll have two conflicting things, so you are kind of drawn to either answer one way or the other. Or they're just trying to ask too much in one question, right? So really just what those questions are, the different kinds. That's all I'm looking at there. Survey methods, the advantages, right? They are quick to distribute. They're strong on reliability. They're cheap, right? It's easy to do a survey. You just kind of email blast people. And then the disadvantages, like it says in your book, um, they're pretty weak on validity because people may lie in a survey. Let's see, experimental methods, just the difference between an experimental group and a control group. Hopefully this isn't the first time you've come across this, right? The idea that the experimental group is the one that gets the independent variable and the control group doesn't, so that you can see what the difference is, like what the effect of the research itself is through the control group and measure that against the difference in change for the experimental group. So the independent variable and dependent variable, just the difference there, right? That the independent variable is thought to cause change within the dependent variable, right? So if you change some unit of the independent variable, some difference will happen to the dependent variable. When it comes to the non-academic uses, just the idea that they're looking for an outcome, right? That they're looking for a specific aim. So typically like Gallup polls, a lot of those things they're looking for, not just like an overall opinion. They're trying to, they often neglect the ethics parts and they're just trying to basically get a certain response or, basically find out a way to sell you something, right? Value-free sociology is the idea that you have to, the only way that you can really kind of practice this through Weber's view is to separate yourself from your research so that you're not putting undue bias on your research. The Hawthorne effect, right? We talked about this in class where this guy basically tried to measure productivity and he was trying to figure out like whether or not different conditions improved workplace productivity. So like he turned up the lights, he turned down the lights, he gave them breaks, he took away their breaks. No matter what he did, their productivity went up. And it's because it's really the idea that the Hawthorne effect is the idea that, sometimes the research itself has influence on participants, right? Because the participants know they're being researched or they're being watched, so they act differently. Okay, and then the IRB, the institutional review boards, basically that they're just a group at universities that are responsible for looking at people's research proposals, and they make sure that it's ethical, right? That there's informed consent, that people know what they're getting into, they know what the risks are associated with what research they're doing, and they make sure that human participants aren't going to be harmed. Alrighty, chapter 4. Okay, so what is socialization? It's just the process of learning and internalizing the values and norms of our social groups in society, right? Let's see, the looking glass self, where it's this idea that we imagine how we look to others and we imagine their perceptions of us. And so we experience feelings based on that, and then we change our own behaviors based on how others reflect us, right? So the idea that how we understand the world has everything to do with if we do something, if we get a negative reaction, we might change that. If we do something, we get a positive reaction, we might continue to do that, right? That we are kind of mirroring back what we think people want us to do. Mead, just the different stages of development, right? He talked about the imitation kind of part, the play stage, the game stage. Just that the play stage is typically when you get to the point where you're, imitating the roles of others. So, like saying, I'm going to play mom, right? Or I'm a superhero, or something like that, where they start to kind of understand the social roles. And then game stage, like we talked about in classes, once they hit the point where they could actually play like a decent game of soccer, right? Where game stage is where they start to understand their specific role and how their role relates to the roles of others, right? So that's typically when you're like in your middle school years, like when right before you hit junior high, basically, right? A couple years before that, when you start to understand the perspective of what they call the generalized other, which is really just this idea that, like, not just what will my mom think, what will my dad think, but what will society think, what will they think, right? Sort of kind of looking at a more generalized understanding of how people perceive you, right? Okay, impression management is just how we try to control how other people see us so that other people have a good view of who we are, right? So we use certain presentation and performance tactics in order to try to control how people see us so that when they look at us, they think we have it all together, they think we're awesome, that kind of thing, right? And we talked about this in class, how my example of impression management to the extreme is like Instagram or Facebook, where people only put out the very good, positive things about themselves, but they don't take pictures of and they don't necessarily post about all the awful and negative things that they go through in their life, right? Because they want you to have a favorable image that their life is like perfect. All right, dramaturgy is just comparing life to a social play, right? We talked about this, how within dramaturgy, there's what's considered backstage and front stage, right? So backstage is when you prepare for a performance. So all the stuff you would do to prepare to get on stage, right? So when we talked about it in class, I gave you the example of like, as a professor, to prepare, it's not just the like showing up and wearing professor blazers or whatever. It's also like getting a professional degree, right? Getting my education, preparing the PowerPoints and the materials for class, right? Writing the exams, doing those kind of things. That would be the backstage. And then the front stage is when I actually show up and talk at you guys, right? Where the performance actually takes place. And also really the context of the performance, like why does it matter where it is and what it is, right? So basically, the difference between the front stage and the backstage is how you prepare, and the front stage is you actually performing it and the context in which you perform it. All right. The family is an agent of socialization. Just that they are the primary agent of socialization is all I'm looking for there. They're one of the first people that kind of teach you what the world should be. Hidden curriculum is just the idea that we learn unintentional values and behaviors at school, like showing up on time and sitting on ass and deferring to authority, right? We learn those things just from going to school, but they aren't necessarily on the curriculum. Peers as an agent of socialization, just that once you hit like your teen years or adolescence, it matters way more what your friends think than it does what your family thinks. So your family might be the, primary agent of socialization, but once you hit your teen years, you care less about that. You care more about your peers. Let's see. These next two questions are about the video clips we watched, right? So Jackson Katz one was about the clip from Tough Guys 2. Basically how the mass media constructs masculinity as something that's very violent, right? And that it's something that when people talk about it in the culture, they say, oh, it's biology, like men are just inherently violent, right? Or they'll say, oh, that it's their hormones or things like that, right? And so in that way, people don't really critically look at why there's so much violence in our culture and why there's so much masculinized violence in our culture, right? And really, so what he's talking about in the clip is how a lot of that construct of masculinity being violent and angry and all of that is really encouraged through advertising, TV, films, video games, basically just the overall culture. All right, and then the other video clip, Jean Kilburn was talking about how advertising constructs femininity, right? So meaning that women are expected to somehow compare to photoshopped, unreal, things that are oftentimes when they have women in magazines and things like that, it's like three different people put together. So it's like a really bizarre, weird science kind of situation. So in that same frame, socially, women are seen as passive and overtly sexual objects that are just there for men, right? They have no internalized inherent sexuality themselves. They're just for someone else's pleasure, right? And that normalizes a lot of violence and objectification of women because we see these images over and over and over in the culture every day, all the time, right? And this leads to a lot of real consequences for young girls and women, especially eating disorders and negative behaviors like that. All right, resocialization is just when people have to be socialized again in life, right? The idea that socialization is a lifelong process. So sometimes if you go into a new role, you have to learn to be socialized into that role, right? So going from the role of student to employee, right? That would be like resocialization. All right, different statuses. So basically, just looking at the differences between ascribed, embodied, and achieved statuses. Basically, I'm just going to be asking you about the differences between them, right? Um, and how, one involves just you're born into it, right? And of course, the achieved being much more of like you actually did something, which again, achieved is pretty obvious, as well as embodied. So basically, if you can tell the difference between them, you'll be fine there. Stereotyping, hopefully, you know what that already means. Just having preconceived ideas about people. So role conflict is when you have two incompatible roles, right? So let's say, I think the example we talked about in class is like if you're a parent and an employee, those are two different roles with two different expectations. Like the expectation of employees, you show up to work, right? The expectation of parent is if your kid's sick, you stay home with them, right? So those things can be a conflict against each other. Let's see. Emotional labor is just the idea like when you work, sometimes, especially in the retail world that we work in, you have to either bring up emotion, like manifest or elicit emotions. And sometimes you have to suppress or push down or limit emotions in order to do your job. So either you have to, be nice to people and kiss their ass or, smile when they're being mean to you and those kind of things. So either pretend to be happy or suppress being angry, right? Those kind of things. The saturated self is this idea that we take little bits and pieces of our identity from all these media choices around us, and that kind of affects our own identities, right? We start to see each other through these media things like, oh, we both like The Walking Dead, or oh, we both like this kind of thing. And that can kind of bring us together in a world where we're losing more and more social contact with each other. All right, moving on to chapter 3, ethnocentrism. It's just basically the belief that your culture and your culture's practices and values and beliefs are the best and that other cultures are weird and flawed compared to your culture. So it's just seeing the world through the lens of your own culture and comparing everything else against it as if your culture is right and normal. Cultural relativism is kind of the opposite of ethnocentrism. It's the belief that all people deserve respect despite their differences in cultural practices and that we should, learn from each other and that kind of stuff. Hegemony is just Gramsci's term to describe the aspects of social control where the ideas of the dominant group are accepted by all of society and also like the values and norms of the people that have the most power in society get accepted by everyone in society, even those with no power, because the people that have power have the ability to shape and control the dominant cultural ideologies, or what they call hegemony. All right, a subculture is just a group within society that has distinct values, norms, and lifestyles, right? Versus a counterculture is a group in society that openly rejects society's values and norms. That's the key difference between the two, right? A counterculture could be a subculture, but not every subculture is a counterculture. Cultural imperialism is the idea that instead of, conquering a place with military equipment or things of that nature, oftentimes nowadays through the media systems, we're doing this just through our cultural stuff going, spreading everywhere around the world, right? So our cultural beliefs and practices, and also the kind of consumer products that come with that, get forced through this imperialism to other countries. Okay, chapter five. Anomie, just what, he called it normlessness, just this idea of when you're disconnected from society and you don't feel like you have like strong connections, it's kind of like a loss of norms. Groupthink is just the idea that sometimes people, the more, conformed they are to each other, the closer they are to each other, sometimes they just kind of lose it and either echo each other like an echo chamber or become like yes men and they all agree to the same thing and it's not necessarily a positive situation. Let's see. Internalization is just the strongest type of conformity where not only are you trying to maintain or establish a relationship with a group, but you really adopt the beliefs of the group as your own beliefs, right? You've internalized them. And then the different kinds of authority is what I'm looking for there. So, like traditional authority is based on like you're born being in the royal family or something. So you're like in a monarchy, that would be traditional authority. The legal is going to be someone that's obviously based on the legal system, the legitimate authority of the culture. And then charismatic authority is going to be because people think that person's a good leader, right? Alrighty, and then as far as the essay questions, Milgram and Zabardo both conducted research on conformity in human beings. What studies did they conduct, and what were the ethical issues? All right, so we watched those video clips in class. Milgram, I want you to specifically say in the essay question that he did the study on obedience, and just give a brief description, like a sentence of like, people thought they were shocking other people. He was trying to test. Just the idea that people would do something against their own conscience if someone in authority told them to do so. And he found out that was, the case. Like over 60% of people went all the way to the top of the board. So his was the obedience research. And what was his ethical issue? People felt really stressed. People started laughing hysterically or breaking down. And so you're not supposed to stress out your research participants. And then as far as Zimbardo, he did the Stanford prison experiment, right, where he tried to recreate the prison experience as a actual underground room within Stanford. And he assigned roles to students of like, you either were half of them were guards, half were prisoners, and he gave them the social roles. And the social roles took over and became ways that they actually, the prisoners themselves, a lot of them had psychological breakdowns and had to be released from it. It only went on for like 6 days or 5 days. And then he had to end it because there was so much, tumultuous drama happening with it. The the prison guards themselves got into this very aggressive role and demeaning and demoralizing these men. And it really became this us versus them mentality, even though they were all just students. No one had committed a crime, but it was the power of the situation, right? Being a defined situation where you have social roles. Yeah, so basically both Milgram and Zabardo, they had the same kind of ethical issues that they harm their participants psychologically, emotionally. But of course, their studies were pretty different, right? Obedience versus the Stanford prison. So that's all I'm looking for there is just to establish which one did what research and what was the problem? They hurt people, right? All right, second one, blah, 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 McDonaldization. What is it? So when I say explain its parts, I mean the 4 parts, right? The efficiency, calculability, predictability, and control, right? What does that even mean? Efficiency, like obviously trying to make everything as efficient as humanly possible, breaking down every step within the restaurant into, very simple steps that can be carried out in a very robotic fashion. Calculability, which is all about, you know, quantity over quality. Trying to make as much money in as fast a time as possible. Predictability is the idea that no matter which one you go to, it's always the same, right? So you're going to get what you think you're going to get. The food tastes the same. The restaurant looks the same. Everything's the same. And then, the control aspect being, limiting human action and trying to replace them with technology. So I'm looking for all four of those parts. And then I want you to give an example from your own experience of how this concept operates in our everyday lives. So, something that you've experienced that does this. So, like the example I would give to relate to McDonaldization, not using McDonald's would be like the food ordering apps, right? The idea that nowadays you can just order something from your phone and put your card number into that, and you never have to interact with a person. You show up at a restaurant, and you just grab your food and go, right? So it's obviously efficient for you and for the restaurant to have people just kind of come in and out quicker. It's calculability because they basically give you an exact time it will be there, right? And what time to pick it up, what will be ready. And they're able to get more customers in and out the door that way, so they make more money. It's predictable because what you order is what you get, and you will get the same food at every place that you do that same food ordering app kind of thing. It's going to taste the same, it's going to be the same. And then control, because you've basically gotten rid of any human interaction whatsoever. Now you're just doing it through your phone, through an app. So now they don't have to pay someone to work there. They make more money, so it's also calculable. But the control aspect too is that you're going through technology instead of people. Or like when you walk into Panera, how even when you go up to order, you could walk up to order, but they still have tablets right there. So if there's even like one person in line, you can skip a human person instead of waiting in line like a normal goddamn person. Like what people used to have to do, basically. Like these minor inconveniences of human life. Like, oh my God, I had to wait 5 minutes to order my food, right? We're trying to get rid of all of that, but in the process, it's very dehumanizing, just like bureaucracy itself, because we become more and more isolated, and we eliminate more and more jobs. That it's definitely contributed to the fact that the wages are falling for people as well in the same time period. So anyway, basically, I'm looking for you to give me an example from your own life of McDonaldization, maybe a job you work at or something else you've seen that's similar to my explanations, and explain how it's similar. How is it efficient? How is it calculable? How is it predictable? What aspect of control is there of trying to like eliminate people's jobs and replace them with technology, right? Think about that and give me an example of that, and you'll do great on that question. Okay, so that's it. So hopefully this helps. And yeah, I will upload this as soon as possible.